Welcome to Conscious I, living in authentic connection and harmony with self, others, and the world. Featuring Ravi and Savitri. I'll say good morning, Ravi.
Good morning, Savitri. Nervous system regulation is where it's at.
And that's what we're going to dive into today. So, there are many different things that we can talk about. Um, how we get there, how we aren't there, and what things we can explore to find the ones that really fit for us individually.
I think it's uh, worth a mention that we probably, most of us are living in an environment where it's challenging to regulate your nervous system. It gets triggered a lot um, in our culture, in our society. Um, that values a hustle and grind kind of mentality. Um, for one thing. And then, of course, we have multiple added layers of what's going on socio-politically that creates a lot of added stress in our environments. So, nervous system dysregulation is maybe kind of the norm for many of us.
I was going to say, I'm not even sure where on a scale we might be as a collective, or any of us could be individually. Do we ever get to regulation anymore? Do we have time to really, I should say, bask in it and get bored with it? Because I know that was always in my family in the summer, and as we're coming up to summer, it brings it to mind that uh, we were encouraged to get bored through the summer so that we became creative and found things to do. And when I think of those days, I think of how there was that angst, got to be doing, doing, doing. And it's almost like you come down from that, you detox from dysregulation. And at some point you get there. I can't say as an adult that I have found that in my memory. I know it's there somewhere. We don't have the time, and we get exposed to so many things that we say to ourselves, "This is out of my control," which right away spikes the dysregulation. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the practices that do, we say Kundalini yoga is the householder's yoga because you can you can do a practice in a very short amount of time and get a really impactful benefit. Um, so I can also choose to step back from taking in, an onslaught of information through technology, which is so easy to access information these days. And that's part of what can keep us in that triggered state. And so there are things that we can do to mitigate our interaction and reaction to the environments around us. And I think we're going to talk about that a lot today.
Mhm.
But certainly our society, our culture, the collective can make that very challenging. And then personally, we can make that challenging for ourselves without really realizing it. We can get in our own way of feeling like we have to do things when we can really step back. And that might be because of that pervasive, if you're not doing, you're not producing, you're not being productive, then what are you doing? And I like that you mentioned that childhood memory because there's a period of discomfort when you're down regulating, where
Certainly
there's that
is.
almost like you said, that experience of anxiety of I should be doing something. So even getting to that place where you can enjoy the regulated nervous system can take some practice because if you're not used to it, just the the paths, right, that we've developed and through the repetitive patterns, through repetition, to get out of those can be a little bit uncomfortable. So
Yeah, and from
it's
a physiological standpoint, I mean, it could be seen as an addiction as well, because the busier we are, the more productive we are. That gets back to the whole idea that in the West, especially, if we're not making money, we're not being productive. And if we're not active, we're not being productive. And we get rewards for being productive. We get, attagirls and attaboys, and we get money, and we get gifts, and we get things, and we get approval from that. And that is part of designing an addictive behavior. So, not to get into that too much, because that's another um, piece of the puzzle in this story of dysregulation and nervous system regulation. But we might want to keep that in mind, is that when we do come back to a more regulated nervous system, that our physiological structure, the amygdala, is going to give us a little resistance, sometimes a lot.
I think it is worth noting too that it's kind of the same coin, addiction to substances that we use to escape. So we can use, we can become addicted to that dysregulated nervous system and keep
Yes.
ourselves in that fight, flight kind of activity because it doesn't feel safe to relax. It doesn't feel safe to um, allow that down regulation. And on the opposite end of that spectrum, we can go, to the other side of that extreme, and we can use substances to down regulate our nervous systems and kind of escape from the the things that keep us in that state of dysregulation. So we use something to remove us from that, take us somewhere else, and then we end up into we can easily end up in an addiction in that way as well. So there's different ways that addiction does play into dysregulation of the nervous system. So I think that's worth a mention for sure.
Yeah, I have to say that uh, even the little story that I just shared about boredom in the summer can be send us towards something that still is all consuming and is considered productive. So it's part of who we are as humans. I think that's the thing, first of all, that I came to as we started looking at this with a real focused point of view. We hear about nervous system regulation all the time. It shows up in so many different ways, uh, psychologically, sociologically. People are talking about the collective having nervous system dysregulation right now. And we also bring it up in practices as well, from the in a therapeutic way. And I use that word not as a licensed individual, but as a way of bringing us into a more calming state, which we identify with as being more regulated. So there are certain attributes that we exhibit when we're dysregulated, and others that we attributes that we exhibit when we appear to be regulated, either to ourselves or others. So that's some of what I think we wanted to get into today. If I think about how we planned this a little bit, because we do throw that term around a lot, not just us, but we hear it a lot. Nervous system regulation, and it's to the point where it's become a bit of a jargon. So we thought
It's a
maybe.
bit of a buzzword,
Mhm.
or a buzz concept. It's one of those things that everybody's mentioning, but I think there's the very real. So there's the physical. I mean, if we break it down to the physical components,
Mhm.
we have our central nervous system, or our nervous system is where we receive energy or input, and we get commands and signal relays to respond and react in different ways, and some of those are automatic and some of those are conscious reactions. But when we look at the physicality of it all, if our central nervous system is our brain and spinal cord, and then our peripheral nervous system, is that those it's fascinating to me when you look at the human body and you look at the nervous system and then you look at a large computer system with all of its cords running out from its central system, how clearly alike they are.
Mhm.
But these physical components, like you mentioned, the amygdala, um, and they have their functions, and so there are functions that we know about, just the physical aspect of it, where when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, we're fight, flight, freeze, and when our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, that gives us an opportunity to rest and digest. And so I think it's not just a buzz, word of, oh, do this and that. There's
That's right.
actual physical things going on in our body that
Mhm.
a lot, make us feel this way, or that we can regulate through practice to keep our minds and bodies in a more calm or peaceful state. Because really, what is regulation? What does it mean? And I think if we think of, okay, let's come down to the physical aspect of it. What happens when we're dysregulated? What does that look like? How does it feel? What's going on in our bodies?
Yeah, and some would say it's one of those chicken and egg dilemmas, in that our behaviors build neural pathways, those repeated patterns support those neural pathways and keep them strong and built, and to the point where it becomes more automatic that we would choose that behavior in the way that it's most comfortable to us, because there's a reward system built in around it as well. So, what comes first? Choosing certain behaviors and repeating those behaviors. The neural pathways then, at some point, become the highway. Well, it's well paved to do those certain things, or to have that um, arousal of dysregulation, is basically what I'm talking about. And so people gravitate and create more drama in their life to keep that elevation of dysregulation, because that feels like the way that they are. It feels like they're they're comfortable with that, and so there's no awareness that it is a dysregulation. So what does that mean? Now we have to look at, is physiologically, the functions of the physiology driving our behavior, or is behavior driving the physiology? And they're so integrated that when we start trying to pull it apart to find what might be considered our unique nervous system regulation, and that's not going to be the same for everyone, um, we we have to play with both changing our behavior, our thought patterns and choices, and allowing the physiology to accommodate that in a way that the cortisol level lowers on a regular basis. And we begin to get very in tune with how our body is responding, so that we're able to catch it at a moment when maybe we're feeling a little more regulated, and stay in that space for a while to build some strength there, to allow the body to settle into that way of being, physiologically, cognitively, emotionally, all of those things, so that the body begins to learn. The brain, the mind, the nervous system all learns that we have chosen a different behavior, and we're going to begin to build that and solidify it. So I'm speaking in lay terms, obviously, to try to help come into understanding of what feels, and it starts with a feeling. And I think this is where you and I go back to practices, where if you're in a meditation, or you're in a practice, or you're out in nature, or doing some of the things that help us do the thing we call relax, do the thing we call restore. Those are the times that we want to pause and really experience it. And over time, just like any other behavior, the body's going to look for that and respond to it, and we'll be able to stay in that longer and longer and longer without a disruption.
What you were just explaining is where my mind is going, is that that's hard. It's hard to define. Even though you might know the definition of it cognitively, what does it feel like to you? What does nervous system regulation feel like to you? Definition wise, it's to me, when your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems are balanced, right? So our sympathetic nervous system is going to be active in ways that we need to stay safe. But when it's overreactive and our cortisol is always pumping, or I've always, I'm at a 10 all the time. I may not know what a regulated nervous system feels like. And so this is my normal. This is my norm. And so, like you said, when I start to downregulate or do those things that allow me to relax, restore, rest, does that increase my anxiety? Because because that doesn't feel safe to me, because that's not my normal, because it doesn't, it feels then that I'm not being productive, or
Right.
that I won't experience something or accomplish something because I'm resting, relaxed, or I'm restoring. I think it's important that, again, most of us have been living, unless you've been able to break that cycle through a practice, in such a dysregulated state that that's your normal. That's what feels comfortable. It's that, whether, we see that with in different areas of life, an addiction, for example, it's not healthy and it's not maybe benefiting you, but it's what feels comfortable and safe. So like you said, how do we do that? What is it that we do to acclimate our bodies and our minds to a place of where we feel safe when we're resting,
Right. And not
digesting
guilty.
information?
Yeah.
Hmm.
And not feeling guilty. And
And not,
yeah.
or shame,
Or
because
shame.
so anxiety, so those, you might be feeling something like anxiety. Again, if you're, some people, when you sit down to rest and relax for the first time, it might be like, I need to be doing, you can't get your mind to calm down. Or sitting in meditation, right? You're thinking about all the things that you need to do. That's one of the stages of meditation, is, your mind is racing because I could be doing this, I could be doing that. And that's part of the practice, is coming into that state where just let that go. It'll be there when you get done with this. Give your mind and body time to rest and restore. And that can feel counterintuitive. So anxiety can come up, guilt or shame of what we should be doing. I think it's interesting that that's part of unlearning what society has taught us about rest and relaxation and its purpose and place in our lives in a capitalistic society.
Yeah. Yeah. It something you said too was uh, jogged my mind a bit, or maybe I should say sparked it. And that is that what we have learned is normal for ourselves. And it made me think, and first I thought, yes, but, and then I went to, okay, and we need to use and there. And the great thing about humans, one of the things, is that we are adaptable. And so in this case, being adaptable to a more dysregulated state still keeps us surviving, but it's not, like you said, healthy for us long term because it continues to cause damage. So we can think about becoming adaptable. It doesn't hit that word change or transform, which sometimes can feel really scary and permanent, even though nothing's permanent. But you think about, okay, I'm going to change. Well, from this to that, it's a black or white situation. But when you adapt along a continuum that allows us to go from one state to another at our own pace. And with the um, with what you were saying about coming into a state of rest and restoration, the adaptation part is often around helping to mitigate or ameliorate the issues around grief and shame, guilt. And once those have been rounded out, smoothed, and maybe set aside for another time, we can start looking at ways that we can move into that space in a way that becomes comfortable and creates a new norm for us individually.
Hmm.
Now, all this sounds great, right? We're into some theory and some thoughts about process. It's when we actually try it on, that's when it gets a little bit challenging because we want to
And
revert.
that's,
Mm-hmm.
of course, yes, that's it. We naturally, as humans, we go to our default. Um, it's the more comfortable place for us. And then as you begin to practice and you notice that difference, that like you mentioned, there's got to be some reflection and some observation
Mm-hmm.
that goes on. Um, and that's oftentimes the case when we start practicing. It feels like things get worse before they get better. There's a lot of garbage that comes up, I think, and something that if folks are new to a meditation practice or a physical practice, you know how your muscles get sore. The
Mm-hmm.
first time you do a workout or a yoga sequence, you might be like, wow, I haven't felt that muscle before. I'm doing something different with my body that allows me to feel something different, feel something in a different way. So when we do meditation practice, we might be feeling our emotional bodies in different ways
Mm-hmm.
that we're not used to. Maybe things come up and we get triggered by traumas that are kind of, come up, they get shaken loose and they start to come up into our conscious mind. And that can be really uncomfortable. And so what's interesting to note is what is my default pattern reaction?
Mm-hmm.
Do I, immediately go to a numbing agent? Do I become upset? Do I experience a lot of shame, guilt, or grief? Um, those are not bad, quote unquote, bad feelings. They're guides.
Mm-hmm.
So when we sit with those guides long enough, we've mentioned this in many ways through many episodes, and we can sit with these emotions. If we can shoo them away from our table, or we can welcome them to the table and we can commune with them. And when we sit with them long enough, they really start to reveal who and what they are, and we can see things more clearly. And now I can begin to process and think about how I want to respond to these feelings instead of just reacting to them. And I get to take some of my power back because they're not stealing that energy from me anymore. So through that, but that in that practice, it's uncomfortable to sit down with those feelings that come up at first. Um, to come to that place of regulation, we often have to learn how to respond to what comes up, either inside or outside of us. So you mentioned that chicken and egg scenario. Uh, we don't get to determine what comes our way, but I can determine how I sit with that experience or how I sit with that information, the space that I hold for it. Um, do I allow space and time for a different response than my default reaction that might allow me to stay more regulated? We've talked a lot about before about how a lot of the information that's put out there now, especially it seems, is designed to trigger us, to keep us in a state of chaos and fear. So one of the most powerful things that we can do, even though it might feel, if there's a sense of guilt of, I should be doing this. Guilt is kind of a guide that says you've done something wrong or incorrectly. So when we sit with that message, where is it coming from? Can I identify it as something um, that can transform, or will you use that like that I can see in a different way? But that idea of guilt can come from inside of us of I've done something wrong. And if that is the case, if there's something that is done that's out of alignment with your authentic way of being, then you can ameliorate that. You can come back to into alignment. Or guilt is sometimes that comes from outside of us that says you're doing this wrong. And I can assess that. And I can say, is it, or is this is this more aligned with my authentic self and what is outside of me? I don't really need to align with that. I don't need to align with that thought or idea or way of being. And once I can release that and let that go, that transforms that perspective.
Hmm. Hmm. And we're more ready to transform through adaptation. So as we become more aware, self-aware, and understand the process intellectually, we can weave together the physical, emotional, and intellectual experiences that either bring our nervous system into regulation or dysregulation. And it's interesting you were talking about the physical thing. What came to mind is, and I think we all could probably have at least one example of this, hopefully. But if you hear a piece of music or a song, it can transport you back to a time where you had a significant event when that song was part of that. Maybe you heard it. Maybe you were having a dialogue with someone and you're driving somewhere and a song comes on, or you put something on, um, you know, and listen to it purposely. And then a few days, a couple years, a decade or two later, that song comes into your ear in whatever way it does. And right away, you're transported back to that dialogue that you had at that time. And all types of physical activities, events in our lives are cataloged. We often say in our memories, that would be the brain, but also cataloged in the body. So, one of the things that I've found over the years that I've been teaching somatic, and I'm moving into that a lot more deeply with people, is that first of all, I have to say this to start. It's not a silver bullet. We're not having that. But certain movements, certain positions of the body, certain pressure points that we apply to the body through different postures. And this also comes out of Hatha Yoga and Kundalini Yoga as well. But somatic is fashioned in a way to help bring some of those things out of the physical self. So if we think about the brain being the command center and the body being the hard drive where all the reality is stored, you may find that if you're a gardener, you go out and start planting your seeds for spring. It's that time of year, so I'll use that example. And as you come to this space, it may be a brand new space that you've never tilled the soil, you've never planted this type of plant before, this brand new seeds. But all of a sudden you're transported in time, in your memories, just because the act of touching the earth, the act of being in a body position close to the earth, kneeling or stooping down, or however you choose to do it, brings back a flood of memories. Now, some of them are going to be great, some of them aren't. And that's what happens in somatic. As we go through different movements, those movements generate awakening in the body and bring memories to mind that might be joyful. Someone after class might say, I laughed hysterically when we did that. And someone else will come right back at me with the second message saying, I was in tears. I had to take a minute and just sit and breathe. And so this is where I think in somatic it's important to be able to have that dialogue, or at least that checkpoint with someone afterwards, because some of the movements are just very slow unfolding. Might take a year, 2 years, 3 years before someone says, oh, I was getting these little snippets, that's my word, these little snippets of things here and there over the last few weeks, and then suddenly I got a full vision of this memory. And they want to decode it. They want to feel how it fits into the current life. And then perhaps release if there happens to be sadness or grief or trauma around it, or embrace it if there's joy. So it becomes a guide to us based on what we've experienced. There's a whole map of the body that we go through with different touches and movements that can generate some things if we choose to go after something specific, like confidence or lack of judgment, self or from others. Those types of things are embedded in the body, and they help us bring those things out by choice. Sometimes they come out not by choice, and you mentioned that, but we can also generate a particular series of movements to help bring something forward for someone who feels like, I'd like to work on this and let's see what we can do with it. So I wanted to mention the somatic thing because I think that it factors into Kundalini and Hatha Yoga as ways, and meditation as another way to come into with pranayama, a great way to find some regulation. And if we define it simply as a sense of calm, great. Let's take that because we certainly could use some of it in our lives. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, 100%. Um, I like that you mentioned the somatic practices to call out or bring into our conscious awareness of what we can let go of and release because yeah, it is, we hold a lot of trauma in ourselves and um the memory of ourselves is quite long. And I love uh the practice of Kundalini because it goes deep. It goes I've said it before and I'll probably say it 100 more times, but it works without your having to think about it. If you just do it, the practice, right, it will
Mm-hmm.
work. However, our intention, as we mentioned with somatic, that somatic movement, our intention can amplify that practice. Our intention can oftentimes even, I don't want to use speed up, but can expedite a shift or a transformation or an adaptation that maybe we've been working toward for so long or keep encountering. Like if you notice these things that you keep encountering in life, but you just can't get over it or get through it, I found like that practice, the right practice will come at the right time.
Mm-hmm.
What you're seeking is seeking you. And it's so interesting how the right practice will just kind of make its way into your life. And by doing that practice for whatever period of time. It's interesting. I've noticed in my personal practice how something will come into my life and I'll do the practice. Um, Not knowing necessarily what it's there for, like you said, and then when it's time for that to go, it just no longer, you can just sense and feel that, okay, that has been worked out, that's been worked through. Maybe that practice just falls away, or it doesn't feel as necessary anymore. And then it might be months later where it's that, oh wow, something occurs and you react differently, you respond differently. And maybe you don't make that connection, but maybe you do, because sometimes it's in my personal practice, it's been very clear, like, oh, that's what that was about. That's what I was working through. That's, you know, sometimes that subconscious, uh, whatever it is, memory, information that's coming up, you might be working through something without even fully realizing what it is until you get to the other side of it. So
Yes.
that's to me why having a practice is so important, because it will come, that just pay attention to what comes in and how you respond to that, because very often, um, when you're doing those, when you do have a practice, it will bring something in that you may not even be fully aware of yet.
Yes. And there are so many things that have been brought into our Western modern world that I see as derivations of the yoga practices that have been prevalent for ages. Um, and looking at some research around uh, nervous system regulation, there are quite a few things that sound really familiar. Like, for instance, there's a list of 8 things that show up that are recommended, and maybe one of them or none of them will work for you, but you might try it. Movement based stimulation. Well, isn't that what we talk about in our practices? That's what it is. So I'm looking at this from the psychological world at this time, the research in that. So you'll hear different language, but let's see how it connects. Tapping and rhythmic activation. So we know that touching certain areas of the body are going to stimulate something. That also comes out of acupuncture, Ayurveda. It also comes out of rhythmic activation. We've got dancing. So we just visualize that. Eye and neck stimulation. So we do certain exercises around that. Breathing
Drishti is what
exercise.
I think of, right? In
Yeah,
yogic
yeah.
practices, we direct our gaze and your inner gaze and your eye gaze
Mhm.
in practice.
And we have breathing exercises, aka pranayama, right?
Hmm.
Because pranayama is breathing is just part of it. It goes much deeper than just breath work, you know. Um, Vocal and throat vibration. We have chanting. We have mantra. Um, Touch and pressure stimulation. Okay, again, we get back to acupressure, and in Ayurveda, the pressure points, body brushing that you mentioned an episode or two ago. Again, I apologize. I don't know which one it is. They're all just one big, long, continuous thread of dialogue that we've been having that I love. So, but that in itself is one of those things. And any kind of sensory support, you know, music, temperature changes, cold and warm, saunas. Um, and so these are all therapeutic recommendations for someone who may be doing that kind of work for a patient or a client. And when we look at those, we can almost directly see the through line from the practices that have been with us. So you can choose your methodology. You can choose
Mhm.
your lineage. You can choose your point of focus. Maybe for movement based stimulation, you have one way of doing that, and someone else is doing yoga. Someone might be in a workout setting. Someone may be in a sports oriented situation, runners or, um, other types of sports, skiing and that type of thing. So there are lots of examples that go into these categories. And I found it so interesting when I saw this single page of this list. I'm like, mm-hmm, just change the words, but we're still using the same processes because the body technology that you talk about a lot is what it is.
Right, that hasn't changed.
Right.
But how we work with it is malleable. Like you can, like you said, you can choose your modality.
Mm-hmm.
But we're all self-sensory humans with more than just the body. We've talked about, integrating mind and body, and I think we, as a society, as a culture, we've made that connection. And then we've gotten into okay, well, the emotional bodies are important as well. And then we just need to pull in the spiritual body and, we're practically there.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so it is interesting to see how those relationships um, come into play over the years, and how yoga has made its way into our culture. And it was I primarily, and I can't speak, I'm sure everybody's experience is different, but as far as the more pervasive idea of it, it's been just about the physical movement and it
Mm-hmm.
being good for the body. And of course, then we learn, oh yeah, no, it's really impacting my mind and how I perceive the world, and my emotional state is improved. Um, So it is funny to see. We know we've talked about that multiple times, how the science is supporting the wisdom of the ages more and more.
I call it
Um,
catching up, but yes, supporting it is
yes,
one thing.
right. Catching up. That's a great.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and here we are, we get to be like, oh, this, I'm experiencing it for the first time. And it's been here all along. So,
Right.
uh, it's one of those fascinating, um, practices. It's fascinating that the practice has always been there and that it's like when you're ready, the teacher will appear.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are also some lessons from crisis management. We can go into that. And that takes a different kind of stealing the mind, not as in stealing, taking away, but stealing as in making strong. Um, so, a couple things if you would like to practice it when you think about coming into a crisis. And we have those things in our lives on a regular basis, for better or worse. But we also have things, let's think about the weather. Okay, so we may have a weather circumstance which is completely out of our control. And as it approaches or as we experience it, there is a certain amount of triggering that goes on for people, even those that are used to being in certain environments with some weather events. So, what happens when we start thinking about the crisis management around that? The first thing we do is we get a warning of some type, and we live in tornado land, so we get those, especially now this time of year. So, the first thing we do is we get on a watch, and it may happen. Okay, so we get to ease into it a little bit, unless it's a sudden thing. So we start thinking about how have we prepared to be in a certain location, have certain things there. I think about, okay, I need to go to the lower level, get my dogs and cat down there, make sure they have water and a little bit of food. I mean, it's an event. I mean, it's preparation. There are things that happen. So that's just one thing. But at the same time, what are the things that you value that you would take to a safe place? So that's probably the first thing. So when we get triggered and our nervous system gets dysregulated, we can stop and say, what do I value? What's important here? And it gives us a point to pause and take a look at what are our expectations around this thing that showed up? What can we control and what can't we control? What we can control, let's do something about it. Let's begin to act. So the physical movement, one of those things that was on this list, right, gets us into releasing some of the trauma and coming back to regulation so that we can get into a safe space. Now, that could happen based on the weather event, or it could happen for an internal trigger as well, something that nobody ever sees. It just happens inside. Um, we want to come back to a place where we feel like we have some semblance, even one thing, that we can control and latch onto that and make it happen. So, looking at crisis management from an inside and outside perspective, there are some things from there as well that worked. And the big thing is just to get control of some kind of intellectual thing so that our emotions can be held over here and not cloud our ability to do the things and create the actions we need to do. And I just took a deep breath, and that's another thing that helps us take that pause, give us life force, oxygenate the brain, let's get the body ready. And those things, I think, are things that we see in people that are in high stress positions, surgeons, EMTs, people that are, in the firefighting world. They have gone through so much intensive training that we can leverage some of the things that they've learned and what they've learned to do to help manage chaos, trauma, and dysregulation. Because they certainly, and the military, I don't mean to miss you because you're there, and there are other professions all around. You come to a challenging customer comes your way. That's
Mhm.
going to dysregulate your nervous system right away if there aren't some internal tools and processes to help you get through that. So I just wanted to mention that as something that kind of came my way, not on purpose. It just showed up as I was looking at our topic for today.
Well, and that key point is if, the coming to what can I control?
Mm-hmm.
So if I try to control that situation, whether it's, an intense situation, like well, it could be just a customer you're dealing with. If
Mm-hmm.
your goal is to control that person or their responses, you end up, you're going to inflame the sympathetic nervous system, um, and really stay dysregulated. What can we control? One of the first things that we can control is something that we're doing all the time, and that's our breath. And you notice, when we get frustrated, we maybe huff and puff, or, after a tense situation, there's a big whoosh, a big let go of air because you've been
Yes.
holding that in. And so as that is what can we control? We got to look to, turn that inward. And one of the first things I can control is my breath. My breath helps me calm and control my mind. And by control, I don't mean, I mean just bring it into a focus, allow what comes into, I control my response to the external stimuli. So, that is, our sense of discomfort often comes from that desire to control, but is that a focused inward or outward?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's, what everything that you said, not to just repeat, but that sense of, I mean, that when I just recall, I mean, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it's such a standout moment in my life, um, when I really could not wrap my mind around that I couldn't change a person. Now, I had to change my reaction to them or my response to them or how I perceive them to get through a working relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And that was. I think, and I say this because to some of our listeners who may be at that point, we all get to a point in our lives where we want a situation to change so badly that if just that situation would change, everything would be right. Everything would be okay. And can we get to that point where we can let go of that need to control that situation and learn instead to control my breath, the direction of my mind, um, where I choose to put my body and my mind in any given situation, and then see how that situation evolves. Um, that's the real question is where do I put my control? Because if that sense of control is coming from something that is outside of me, well, that's going to feel real good as long as it's going my way. But what happens when that changes?
Hmm. And actually, then we realize we don't really control that if it's
We're
outside of
not in
us.
control of a
Hmm.
single thing.
Right.
So, yeah,
Yeah.
that's the lesson. And
And you mentioned the word control the breath. Breathe, the whoosh of breath. Describe the breath, and I just kept seeing in my mind that is foundational to the practices that you and I talk about and we have in our lives, is that the breath guides the movement. And bringing those together quiets the mind, because the mind's then very busy. It's trying to figure out what movement are we doing and how do I continue to breathe to make it happen. Because we know that when we get in a flurry, at least I do, maybe some others do too, I'm rushing around. As much as I have practiced yoga and pranayama and years of that, I can lose this. If things get a little stressful, deadlines are tight, maybe the timeline's tight, and I'm trying to get somewhere on time, I might be mouth breathing or holding my breath. And as soon as I make that realization and take a deep breath and just a minute of some quiet pranayama, just stop and do that, I realize I have all the time in the world,
mm,
where I thought that I would never get everything that I needed to get done. You'd be surprised how much you can get done in a minute or two
mm.
when your breath is flowing and you're moving in a nervous system regulated way.
Right. The haste makes waste,
Oh,
the
yeah,
whole
that one.
axiom is, when we're all caught up in a tizzy and then we misstep here and we have to go back and redo here. Whereas if I can just take that breath and recenter, it's almost like a portal, right? A magical portal that opens up all the time you need. And you know what? If something doesn't get done and the world didn't collapse, wow, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I like to think
Um,
of it as a factory default, and my hard drive just was wiped clean and I'm ready to start again. So,
you're right. You hang on to those things that we think, the way that I know from my experience and my history that I could build up my mind as to I have to get this done or I have to control this or and then something slips and oh, if that didn't get done, did my world collapse? It hasn't happened yet. So learning to just kind of take one moment at a time
mhm.
and let go of my need to control an outcome. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, it's been a bit of a game changer. And you you really realize that practice of it's that simple foundational practice of coming back to the breath. Um, it's that thing that's happening all the time, but when I choose to control that, to use a practice, whether it's a lion's breath or a breath of fire, and I can control my breath in any situation, but to sit down and practice pranayama, how I can use that, then again, when you are able to do that on the mat, something happens in life and I can respond in that way. So It's that microcosm of the macro. How we do anything is how we do everything. So that practice of breath control, pranayama, allows me to respond differently in the world because I practiced it on the mat. And now I do something differently, and wow, that changes my next, step. And all of a sudden, life isn't happening to me anymore, but I get to respond and choose a different perspective and way to move forward in life.
Mhm. Yeah, and I just want to offer a mudra because I use mudras a lot and we use them in practices. This mudra is one to regulate the nervous system. It brings on a healthy nervous system, and it's called the Vyana Vayu, which is air or breath. Vayu is mudra. And we bring the tip of the ring finger on the right hand to the tip of the thumb. On the left hand, we bring the tip of the middle finger to the tip of the thumb. And you turn the palms up and just let the arms soften. And try it. Just bring the hands into that shape. For me, I've practiced this one long enough that my body knows what it means. And so the minute I put it in place, I take a deep cleansing breath, which just naturally happens. So it can be a go to. There are reasons, physiological reasons, there are marma point reasons, there are all types of other reasons that we don't really need to go into right now, that sometime we will. But mudras are another way to bring a point of focus, especially when practiced on a regular basis. And they're all specific to certain things that you might want to accomplish or reach for in a practice.
And and we'll give one more practice that Nadi Shodhana we've talked about before,
Yes.
but our for maybe listeners who are new to practice, our left nostril, breathing through our left nostril can activate our parasympathetic nervous system and allow us to bring in that calming and cooling energy. So we can balance uh, the nadis, the nervous system regulation by doing alternate nostril breath between the left and right nostrils. Or if you want to really activate your parasympathetic nervous system, you can also just sit for a few minutes and block the right nostril, just close with the thumb
Mhm.
and close the eyes and just do some left nostril breathing for even 1 to 3 minutes and see how that feels. Because again, we talk about the practice and the technology of the practice. It doesn't really matter if you believe in it or not. If you sit down and you do it consistently, or when you feel triggered, and just take notice of how it feels and see what happens.
Mhm.
Um, because it is something that um, if you think of, you put gas in your car, it's going to run. You don't have gas in your car, it's not going to run. I mean, our bodies, if we treat them certain ways, they're going to respond in different, in certain ways. So give it a try. The next time you're feeling, maybe it's at the end of the day and you're just having trouble unwinding or letting the day go, and just
Right.
sit and practice in the mudra or the breath and just see what impact occurs.
Yeah.
Test it out.
You can come to this mudra and nobody will even notice wherever you happen to be. If you find that there's a tiny bit of stress or a ton of stress coming your way, you just, and you know, there you are. You're
Bring your
there.
attention.
Yep. So this has been an interesting time together, going into this a little deeper. I was thinking it was going to be very analytical and prescriptive, but there's so many options and
Mm.
so much uh, important information about this to help keep us healthy.
There's simple things that I think we often overlook
Mhm.
because the problems and the challenges feel so big, and it seems like that's not going to work, you know?
Right.
I mean, I don't know, why would I do that? But try it. Try it, just see.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, because it's those little things that we can do that can make the biggest difference.
I agree. 100%. Yeah.
Hmm. We'll see.
So please let us know what you think. Comments.
Yes. Give it a try. I'm curious to hear because I know lots of things out there right now are very triggering and it can all feel overwhelming. It can feel like we don't have time for anything. But if you carve out even 3 minutes for yourself and give one of these exercises a try, or whether it's a somatic movement or a breath work, a breath practice that you're doing, we would love to hear about it and hear how you're managing these stressful times because it can get to us all.
Yeah, we want to avoid burnout at all costs, and and as the body becomes more stressed about and dysregulated about things that are happening, that's when we become vulnerable because our immune system is the first thing that gets tired. And when the immune
Mm,
system is tired, then, you know, we may get a cold, we may get the flu, we may get other things as well. But the strong immune system, and you mentioned last time a strong aura
mhm.
and keeping those boundaries strong, it's all part of it.
Right. It's that idea again of, where oh, you got to hustle, you got to grind all the time. If you don't take the time to slow down and take care of yourself, your body will do it for you. It'll take you out. So, definitely I notice, and there are times that sometimes your body kicks in and will just say, no, you've got to, this is a shift, you've got to go through this to re-regulate, recalibrate a system. Um, but we can lessen the impact of maybe recalibrations that we have to do and keep ourselves in that more prime condition by getting the rest and really deep relaxation we need. It's not just, mind numbing. It's really, taking the time to activate the systems, the physical systems that will create space for us to process and to, um, let go of the tensions that can, yeah, lead to dis-ease on many levels.
Mhm. Yeah. So like and share, let us know as we
Let us
mentioned,
know.
and we look forward to seeing you again at the next episode. And thank you for being here.
Sat Nam. Yeah, thank you
Namaste.
all.